Okay, hi everybody. It is it's Monday. It's 1 o'clock, and we're off. Last week, first of all, happy Pesach Sheni to everybody. It's really interesting. One of the things about the 14th of Iyar is that it's one of the rare situations in which there is sort of a makeup arrangements for if you miss a mitzvah. And one of the striking things about it is why. There are all kinds of other mitzvot. If you miss them, you miss them. If you fell asleep at the beginning of Hanukkah and you woke up at the after Hanukkah, there's no way to make it up. If you miss mincha, you can daven twice, but it's not really quite the same. It's sort of make-up, but not really the same. There are only two. There's only the only real mitzvah for which the Torah in advance said, okay, if you couldn't do it when it was supposed to happen, we'll do it now, or you do it later, and that's Korban Pesach. And I think that the reason is very simple. There's something very unique about Korban Pesach, about the Paschal offering, and I think that it actually indicates something about the reason why it has managed to, and I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that the reasons managed to hold onto the imagination of Jews, even as many Jews have unfortunately thrown away so much of their ritual observance, so much of the relationship to Judaism, but somehow Passover still retains some kind of hold. I know in Israel, for example, it's something like 93% of Jews in Israel have a Pesach Seder. Why did the Jews in the desert go out of their way to say to Moses, look, we couldn't, there was a group of Jews who were ritually impure, and they couldn't offer the Pesach, the second Pesach, the first Pesach in the wilderness. And he says, why should we be any less? Lama nigara, why should we miss out? It wasn't just a matter of FOMO. Mehakriv korban Hashem b'moado, that we couldn't offer God's sacrifice at its proper time, which is a funny kind of formulation, for the simple reason that all sacrifices are God's sacrifices. What's so unique about this one? The answer is, I think, is very straightforward, and that is that on Pesach, Jews renew their dedication and their commitment to the covenant with God as a people, because in a very profound sense, Pesach is the birthday of the Jewish people. That's when we left Egypt and started the process that took us out of Egypt, and then first to Sinai, and then once we had the Torah, into the land of Israel. And that's something nobody wants to give up. So that Pesach Sheni is here to talk about second chances, but also to talk about the deep and abiding devotion of the average Jew to his Jewish identity, something which we should never ever take for granted. Okay. That's just with regard to Pesach Sheni. There is a custom, by the way, to eat matzah, if you have matzah floating around the house. There's a custom that you eat. You wash and eat a piece of matzah, or you have your meal based on matzah during Pesach Sheni. It's not a law. It's just an interesting custom to sort of keep it alive, keep it vivid. Okay. We had already started discussing the 17th Mishnah at the end of the first parak. We're almost at the very end. We're almost going to chapter 2, not next week, but probably the week after. Shimon Beno, Shimon, the son of Rabban Gamliel, the elder. In other words, this is the person who's the head of the Sanhedrin, or head of the Pharisees at the time of the destruction of the temple. And he says, Kol yamei gadalti ben chachamim. My whole life I lived among, or I was raised among scholars. It's being the son of Rabban Gamliel. V'lo matzati laguf tov mishtika. I find nothing better for one's well-being, one's body, he says, than silence. So we talked about that last week. And then he goes on and says, V'lo hamidrash ikar ela hamase. It's not what you teach, but what you do, which is important. And then he goes on and says, "V'chol amar bed dvarim mevichid." The more you talk, if you run off at the mouth, you're going to end up sinning. Okay. One of the interesting things about lo hamidrash ikar el hamase, that it's not important what you say, but what you do, or what you teach, or what you demand. The question is, we don't know what the word midrash means. Now, if it means, as many people interpret it, simply that one should put one's money where one's mouth is. That, don't, we already say Shammai had said, "Mormad basei harbe." Don't talk a lot. Don't talk. Just do. Get it going. Don't whatever. Then this is a series. Then we have here an example of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, or Shimon ben Gamliel, before he was ordained, apparently, simply expressing a sentiment which you find literally all over in every major civilization. So they said, put your money where your mouth is. Don't. Yoda would say, do not try, do. In Italian, there's a beautiful expression, tra il dire e il fare c'è di mezzo il mare, that between us talking and doing, there's a whole ocean between the two of them. Talk is cheap. We know all of these little expressions. Now, that's really what makes this interesting. Not so much for the eternity and for the perpetual relevance of what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, but rather for how the commentaries relate to it. In other words, this is the kind of thing that every single person will relate to the words differently and tell you a lot about each commentator and perhaps about the times in which they live. And that's what I found really fascinating going through how these few words are explained. So we're going to jump around a little bit. And sort of give different angles and different perspectives as how this idea of midrash and maaseh, we don't even know what midrash means, indeed play out. Okay, so in the 13th century, there was a wandering preacher, an ethicist and Talmudic authority, whose name was Rabbeinu Yonah ben Avraham of Gerona. Gerona, for those of you who don't know, is a town north of Barcelona. It's in Catalonia. It was a major Jewish center in the 12th and 13th century. It was a major center of mystics, of early Kabbalah. And Rabbeinu Yonah was known as a moralist who would, in fact, go around the world and study, but also preach. And he makes his comment as an ethicist, as a person who preaches a lot. He's best known, by the way, for his book on repentance called Sharei Tshuva, which is considered to be really one of the classics of Jewish moralist literature. Certainly, it's one of these books that people read and learn carefully during the month of Elul, for example, leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So, in his commentary on Pirkei Avot, when he comes to these words, Lo midrash Ikar el hamase, he interprets the word midrash. Midrash could mean, what does the word midrash mean? Now, usually we say midrash means the explanation of the Torah. When I go and I explain verses in the Torah, that activity is called midrash. The word lidrosh means to interpret, to expound. Midrash is the activity of expounding the Torah. Okay. So if that were the case, the simple meaning of the verse, if that's what that means, would be that when it comes to interpreting the Torah, theoretical discussions are not really as important as actual actions, as doing the mitzvahs. In other words, learning legal theory is not as important as actually doing the mitzvahs. And we'll come back to that idea. But that's not how Rabbeinu Yonah puts it. And I think he's actually been somewhat autobiographical. It's the part that sort of jumped off the page at me. Here's a guy that goes around the world and he's preaching. I think from having learned or studied his books, I think he was a nice person. I think he wasn't very scary. Some rabbis are scary, actually. The truth is, certainly these sort of hellfire and brimstone type preachers. I don't know if he preached hellfire and brimstone, but he was certainly. I think he was an effective preacher, judging from the story of his wanderings from community to community. Nobody, to the best of my knowledge, nobody kept him out. Anyways, he interprets the word midrash not to mean how you explain the Torah, but rather lo hamidrash ikar el hama'aseh. It's not important. It's less important what you demand of yourself and of others. It's far more important that you live up to your words. So I think what he's talking about, first of all, as a preacher, and he probably knew a lot of preachers who were, I don't know, fakers, or less than knew how to talk a good game, but didn't know how to act, properly or how to act ethically. You actually have to, again, put your money where your mouth is. If you're making demands of other people, you have to make the same demands of yourself and live up to those demands, and don't make demands of others that you can't do yourself. On the contrary, demand of yourself more and do more than you demand of others. Ultimately, I'll add that if you're a preacher or you're if you're a boss or whatever the case may be, you set a standard that you don't live up to, it's not just a matter of you're a hypocrite. It's a question of you'll undermine yourself, because so what credibility do you have if you're going to go and do that? So I think that he's here reflecting the kind of frustration, the kind of standards he set for himself and didn't set for himself as a preacher going around trying to get Jews to improve their moral and religious lives. So that for him is I think is a very autobiographical statement. So sort of a person pours himself into words, which can mean a lot of things, and this is what jumped off the page for him, and that's something we should always keep in mind when we look at commentaries, when we look at what other people write. Not so much what they say to us, not only what they say to us, but also what they say about the author and the things that bother him. I might be taking this much further than it takes, but let's jump forward a little bit. In the early 15th century, the Catholic Church in Aragon and Catalonia, staged under the aegis of the anti-pope Benedict XIII a great disputation. In which the Jewish leadership of Spain, certainly of Aragon, was summoned to the city of Tortosa to defend the Talmud against charges or against the claim, or to respond to the claim that the Talmud is a Christian book, and that the rabbis were really Christians, and that they coded Christian beliefs into the Talmud, and therefore, if a Jew is really going to be a Talmudic Jew, he really has to be a Christian. The idea was to try to undermine Jewish sustainability and the ability of Jewish separateness by co-opting the Talmud in order to get them to convert to Christianity. And I know that might sound strange to you. That might sound, in fact, insane to you. But I give a whole course on this, actually. Or I have in the past. But at the time, to some people, it made sense. In any case, one of the people who was called to respond to these claims was a man whose name was Rabbi Matityahu Yitzhari. And he left behind also a commentary on Pirkei Avot. And he says, interesting, Lo ha-midrash Ikar ela ha-maase. He said, it's not important what people say. People can be very smooth. People can be very easy. They can try to convince you of anything. You have to see what they're doing, what their actions are, to see who they really are. Now, I don't know if I'm taking this too far, but I hear an echo of the frustration of Rabbi Matityahu Yitzhari, who was he was detained in Tortosa with the rest of the rabbinic leadership of the region, while Franciscan and Dominican friars were wandering around and having sermons to whip up religious enthusiasm and convince Jews to convert to Christianity, and all the rabbis were Tortosa. There's no one to respond. And the Dominican friars, the Franciscan friars, were really convincing, and they were really smooth, and they were really elegant, and they effused love of the Jews. All we want is to save your souls. All we want is to keep you with, to get you with the program, to get you with Jesus. and they could speak as they wanted very freely. Lo hamidrash ikar, not the sermon is one important, but the act should not be conversion. Don't act on it. See what they're up to. I suspect that's one part of what he saw. There's always an immediate, not just an eternal moment in commentaries, but also, as I said, a contemporary moment. Sticking with Spain. There was one of the people who. So this was in the early 15th century. At the end of the same century, the Jews are expelled from Spain. One of the people who was expelled from Spain was a man whose name was Rabbi Yosef Yavitz, who was known as the tzaddik, the righteous person. He was again a moralist, in the sense he was very much into teaching people and trying to sustain them ethically and to have them grow religiously. In his commentary, it's very striking what he says. He says, Lo hamidrash ikar el hama'aseh. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details because he has a very long technical, philosophical discussion. Basically, however, what he says is this. He says, don't think that the ultimate goal of Judaism, the ultimate goal of religion, is simply philosophizing. It's not just about ideas. It's about deeds. The bottom line of the Torah is you follow the word of God. Should you use your mind to understand and to appreciate and to enhance your understanding of the actions that you do? Yes. However, at the end of the day, the nature of man is that his obligations to do what God demands of him as a human being on earth take precedence. Lo hamidrash ikar. It's not understanding or interpreting the Torah is not as important as actually fulfilling the mitzvot. What is he referring? He's referring to a position that he and many others had, that one of the things that undermined. They were struck, Jews, Spanish Jews, just as all Jews, were struck by the fact that starting in 1391, in 1391 there was a countrywide, Iberia-wide pogrom that spread throughout the entire country, and tens of thousands of Jews converted Christianity in the wake of the riots. And this started a process which kept going and going and going. And the truth of the matter is that it seems that most Jews stayed behind in Spain. Those Jews who left, which may it goes as high as 250,000, were nowhere near the majority of Spanish Jews. Their faith, massive amounts of Jews had their faith undermined, and when they had to make the choice between leaving Spain, leaving everything they'd known, a country where their ancestors had been for 1,000 years or more, probably more, because the Jews are in Spain deep into Bayit Sheni, deep into the Second Temple period. They didn't have the fortitude to sacrifice to stay Jews. And then, so the question that bothered those Jews who left is, what happened? What happened? How could such a thing be possible? So many Jewish ethicists, many Jewish moralists said, at least as far as the upper classes were concerned, that they'd gotten to be too damn sophisticated. They'd sophisticated themselves to spiritual death. They thought that they were smarter. They thought that they had understood the Torah, and therefore they figured out what it was all about. They relativized the Torah. They decided that they knew better, since they knew the reasons for the Torah. They don't really need the mitzvot, and that they're sort of above it all. They could, in fact, judge the Torah and decide it's relevant or not. And that sort of putting yourself above God and judging the Torah ultimately undermines faith. And when push comes to shove, and where the rubber meets the road, when there's a challenge which requires sacrifice or not, they didn't have the wherewithal to do it, so they just converted. That's the argument. Lo hamidrash ikar el hama'aseh is a cri de cœur. It's a cry from the heart by Rabbi Yosef Yavitz saying, you can examine the Torah, you have an intelligence, but you don't have a right to judge the Torah or chuck the Torah just because you don't understand it, or because some guy gave you some kind of sophisticated idea that undermines that threatens to undermine your faith. God is bigger than all of that. And that's what's expected. The expected is the act. Whether it's a question of martyrdom, whether it's a question of leaving Spain, that's your commitment, is the action. So again, there's a contemporary moment to that for us, because we encounter all kinds of people say, well, that's what they did then, and I know why the Torah was given, and maybe the Torah, all kinds of sophisticated things. In the light of what we know in contemporary society, we can judge the Torah and say, that's it. Who says? That's drashot. That's midrash. That's interpretation, which, who says that the dominant cultural norms are absolutely right just because everybody says so? As Maimonides says, quoting Aristotle, just because everybody says something doesn't mean it's right. Or as my mother, may she rest in peace, used to say, if everybody else is jumping out the window, would you go too? Anyways, so Rabbi Yosef Yavitz, very different than what we saw in terms of Rabbi Matatyahu Yitzhari or Rabbi Yonah. When he encountered these words, he had a totally different take on them, because every generation has its own way of understanding the words. Lo Midrash Ikar Ela Hamase. More recently, there's another way of looking at this, and that is the question of, unfortunately this is coming up, the question of the moral responsibility of a teacher vis-a-vis his students. Lo HaMidrash Ikar could also be meant to understand, this is how I experience it today, especially in terms of the kind of scandals that have affected rabbinic or Jewish intellectual leadership in the past number of years, in fact even among academics. Lo HaMidrash Ikar Ala Maaseh, doesn't matter how well the person teaches, how great a scholar he or she is. If that person is morally culpable, look at how they act. That's how you determine things. Now, one could argue in an academic setting that one's morality is irrelevant. We don't care. We are morally neutral. We don't really care what the person does or doesn't do. They cheat on their spouses or whatever. Guy's a great historian. Guy's a great chemist. What do I care? When it comes to Torah, that doesn't fly. That never flies. Maimonides put it best. This is based on a passage of the Talmud and Tractate Moed Katan. Ram says in the fourth chapter of the Laws of Talmud Torah. He says, "Ein melamdim Torah." You do not teach someone ella letalmid hagun na'eh b'masav, a person who's honest with integrity and proper comportment and behavior. O letam, or a person who's a beginner, a person who's innocent. Aval im haya holech b'derech lo tova. Aval, if the student is going in has gone off on a bad path, machzir no tol lemutav. You have to work to get him back on the straight and narrow. Umanhigim oto b'derech yishara. Again, you go put him on the straight and narrow. Ubodkim oto, and you check him out. You make sure that he's actually up to moral snuff before you bring him into the classroom. V'char kach machnisim oto lebeit hamidrashim lomdim oto. Okay, and then you can start teaching. The Torah is not an academic discipline. Jewish studies is not Torah necessarily. V'chein harav, and similarly, says Maimonides, in the exact same way, when Maimonides says v'chein, he means this is precisely the same. V'chein harav sheino holech b'derech tova. A rabbi who does not go in the proper path, the good path, he's morally impugned. Af al pi shechacham gadol hu, even though he may be a great scholar. V'kol ha'am tzrichim lo, and the entire nation needs his wisdom. Ein mitlamdim mimenu. You cannot, you must not, you're forbidden to study from him ad shuvo lemutav, until he goes back to proper way, until he does tshuva. Shene'amar, as he quotes a pasuk, "Ki siftei kohen yishmeru dat," that the lips of the priest will guard knowledge, because the priests were the original teachers. V'torah yivvakshu bipihu, and then you can ask instruction from him, ki malach Hashem tzvakotu, because he's like an angel of the Lord of hosts. Amru chachamim, say the sages, im harav domel malach Hashem tzvakot, if the teacher is like an angel of the Lord of hosts, Torah yivakshu mipihu, then you can seek instruction from him. V'im lav, but if not, don't study from him. Interesting question came up when recently Mati Elon, who was defrocked recently, it's one of the rare occasions that somebody being defrocked. Originally, when the scandal about him broke, the question remains: what do you do with his books? Some people said, well, the books are okay. He's just a degenerate. Seems to me, in the course of the case of the Rambam, the books had to go also. In any event, lo midrash ikar ela maaseh, it's not what the teaching is, it's a maaseh. If the maasim, if the behavior, if the comportment, if the moral standing, is not there, then the teaching is no good. I'll tell you the truth, I have a problem. And as I said, in academia, that's not acceptable. A person can be a total moral degenerate, and you quote him. I have a problem with that. I really have a problem with that. There are a number of scholars whose works I'm not saying whether I do or don't, but I can tell you that I have a personal problem quoting them, because I know for a fact things about them that they're reprobates, basically. And as I said, it's not that it's a thing. It's a thing. I have problems with that, and that's true in terms of non-Jews also. One of the great anthropologists of religion in the 20th century was a guy whose name was Mircea Eliade, whose thinking affected me very greatly, not just me, a lot of people. And yet he was a fascist, a Romanian fascist, anti-Semite. So you have to ask yourself, do you quote him? What do you do here? It's an awkward situation. For most people, it's not a problem, but if in the context of this Mishnah, it really is an issue. It does raise the issue, and I think it's something to, in fact, consider in terms of what type of knowledge is, should be affected by the morality of the teacher, and what not. The ultimate. I always just have a Shoah connection. The whole question of. Elena wants to know: was it matter if the book was written before the person did something wrong? Yes, it does matter. It does matter if the book was really written before the person did wrong, Elena. Then in fact, most people say it's okay. Any case, and finally, I'll just mention in passing, because next I want to go into the next Mishnah next week. There is a very lo midrash ikar ela maaseh, totally out of the swing of the things that we've been talking about today. There is an ongoing, very interesting debate that's been going on in the yeshiva world and in the Torah world about this Mishnah. Lo midrash ikar ela maaseh. What is Torah study for? More importantly, what is Talmud study for? There is the position that holds that the highest, and that's the Lithuanian position, which is embodied by this book, the Nefesh HaChaim by Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, that says that theoretical Talmud study is Torah study is the highest thing there is, if it has a practical impact that's sort of like on a lower level. Because there's this entire theory about the highest form of worship is study, and therefore the purer the study, the more theoretical the topic, the purer and more perfect the act of worship. On the other hand, there's Rav Ovadia Yosef Zatzal, for example, in the introduction to a lot of his volumes of his responsa, Yabia Omer, he loses it. He starts well, he doesn't yell, but he's very emphatic. No, 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 no. Too much theory is not good. Which the reason we study Torah is to know how to live. Lo hamidrosh Ikar ela hama'aseh. And how you go about interpreting this Mishnah is in fact would be a litmus test for what position one maintains in on this as far as this debate is concerned. Okay, we've come up to 1:30. We will see you Mitzvah Shem next week. Another Mishnah. Those of you who might have enough matzah left over, go make matzah bread. Put it up on Facebook. Make everybody else jealous. And we will see you. We'll see you next time. Bye.